Welcome to Postscript, conversations on the past and future of the left amid the slow death of Western civilization. For a generation, we've been told about endings. We've been postmodern, post-historical, post-industrial, post-ideological, post-political, post-structuralist, post-socialist, and before it all, post-colonial. But in a world still scorched by capital and empire, politics now returns in the declining West with its old social subjects in crisis. The results are mostly frightening. But at its most hopeful, a new political imagination seeks to decolonize, decommodify, degrow, even abolish the social relations that take our space and time from us and set us against each other. The left once believed in progress. Now our challenge is to repair and care for broken life worlds. As people fight in the ruins over which pasts to revive, industry, empire, or both, it's time instead to write a savage civilization's postscript, reflecting afresh on which traditions of thought and action might help to orient us in uncertain times. So Postscript is a new podcast of reflective interviews and discussion from Tribune magazine, hosted in London by me, Barnaby Raine, with regular guests and friends like Adam Tooze, who's with me today. Adam, welcome.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I think, even though I had much that I wanted to ask you, you were curious as we were discussing the idea for the podcast about what the whole plan was. So what were your your curiosities?
I mean, I'm not coming to this entirely cold. I've been kind of, listening to your ideas over the last couple of months as they've been taking shape. And I mean, one of the things that struck me is that you like to frame this project as a matter of inheritance, of a legacy. And when you put it that way, one of the questions has got to be, what happened? Like, did somebody die? What was it that created this moment of transfer, at the very least from generation to generation? But I think you have a much broader and deeper kind of sense of a break. So I wanted to ask you about that, first of all, to tell our listeners, our viewers, like where you see that rupture as being.
Well, we have much talk today about rupture because we have the sense that 500 years of Western hegemony are coming unstuck, and that for the first time in a long time, people in not only a place like Britain, but even a place like the USA, are beginning to talk about themselves as some kind of periphery rather than some kind of global core. And as China opens itself up to visa-free travel, Brits are going there to peer in and discover what the new civilization might be like, in much the same way maybe as Africans came and reported on Britain in the 1920s and 30s. So there's a sense of a very, very enormous passing of a baton that I think we'll talk about today. But I think that actually follows an earlier kind of crisis and rupture. I think that from roughly the end of the 18th century to the end of the 20th, there was some kind of coherent idea of modernity, from the revolution of slaves in Haiti to the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was some kind of sense that, and of course the lesser important but still important revolution of Parisians at the Bastille, there was some kind of sense that the conscious mastery by human beings over history was a possibility, that people could control their environment, and a concept of freedom that involved people vanquishing all those forces and powers that dominated and subjugated people, and defining themselves outside all conscription to hierarchies, defining themselves as free individuals was actually Marx's horizon, much forgotten. And so I think there was a sense of a story of progress that stretches from slave uprising through to the formation of the workers' movement, through to the victory over fascism and then formal colonialism, the construction of the welfare state and the new international economic order in the 1970s. There was a push, a sense that you could narrate yourself as part of a progressive story of human beings taking control of their history. And in that story, Marx, I think, is a central figure, and he's connected to 20th century feminism and anti-colonialism which were also about people trying to take control of their history and trying to define themselves outside fixed social hierarchies. Capitalism isn't here an economic system of inequality, but a social form of power and domination that Marx wanted people to free themselves from. Marx said in the Communist Manifesto that capitalism is the domination of the present by the past, and communism allows the present to dominate itself, for us to define ourselves. So I think there was a definite kind of possibility, which I think people now find much harder to believe in.
Yeah.
And I can talk about why. But I think that I'm interested in asking, what have we lost? And in escaping nostalgia, what have we lost, not just by trying to dip back into those beautiful ideas of the past, but what might it mean to, as David Scott, anthropologist at Columbia that I'm very influenced by, puts it, he always asks, what might it mean to be a good heir? What does it mean to inherit those old ideas in different conditions?
I mean, the horrifying thing is that language, if you watch like business news, like I do as part of who I am in the world, like that's the language of wealth passing intergenerationally. What does it mean to be a good heir is something that UBS in Zurich is very interesting to educate you in. But that's obviously not the project here. And I think it would be really interesting for you to just say a bit more about what this inheritance might be. I heard in that beautiful flow you just had there, you know, this moment where you said this thing that's often underestimated in Marx, this appeal to freedom. That, if I understand you right, is a key element of what you see as something that needs to be recuperated, inherited, salvaged from the wreckage of this moment.
Yes, I mean, firstly, my connection to the language of inheritance is not through Zurich bankers, but is through a world that some people would associate with bankers, which is growing up as a Jew, where the question was, where tradition is talked about obsessively. And the question of tradition is not just how do we repeat what was done in the past, that's a dead tradition, but how do we exist in dialogue with the past and work out what it means to renew and update for the present, the gifts, the buried treasure that we've been handed from the past. And I think the concept of freedom is a very tricky example of this, because I think that freedom is Marx's central hope. It's not actually very surprising when you realize that he comes out of a tradition of German idealism, of people like Hegel, for whom freedom is the highest goal. But obviously in the 20th century Cold War construction, it's easily forgotten that freedom was Marx's central project.
Yes, because it's substituted by progress or development or economic growth, God help us, or modernization or moving from one stage of history to the next, or some sort of vision of development like that, right? And what you're saying is, no, there was always this other, in fact, higher and more powerful dynamic, which was about the quest for freedom.
Well, I think that Marx's freedom is situated within a belief in progress, development, and I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to grapple with. I think we can no longer have, I feel, the same kind of belief in that Marx had. It's not the idea of progress that he's sometimes associated with, of extremely fixed, determined historical stages. But I think what's so rich about his thinking is that he thinks that the kinds of freedom that we can have depend on the historical moment in which we're situated, something he takes again from that German tradition. And I have been obsessed with this paragraph from his Grundrisse 1857-8 notebooks, where he talks about the kind of freedom that is thinkable for British factory workers and the kind of freedom that is thinkable for enslaved people on plantations in Jamaica. And he doesn't say that one is better than the other, actually, but he thinks that they're different.
So our question is, what would freedom look like in 2026?
Exactly. And for me, to be a Marxist today can't mean thinking that it's the same as what it was in 19th century industrial Britain. But I think it has three faces in 19th century industrial Britain that are very rich. Marx thinks about freedom as free time. He's very, very keen on stressing that real wealth is free time, that real freedom is free time. He thinks about freedom as a certain experience of space. He thinks that what capitalism has made possible by constructing the world market is a kind of cosmopolitan existence where we're not limited by the parochial question of where we are. We can be really global individuals, all-rounded individuals. And And he thinks that freedom is free individuality, which means defining ourselves rather than being limited by our placement in social hierarchies. The opposite of individuality is not being sociable or being in community.
Yeah.
It's being hierarchically defined. So those three freedoms, free time, free space, free individuality, Marx thinks that capitalist production makes possible. It gives us the machines with which we could do less labor. It gives us the world market with which we can be cosmopolitan, rounded individuals. But capitalism holds back. It conscripts us to endless more and more and more labor where we could be having more free time. It has a global division of labor where people in some parts of the world are compelled to produce one thing only, rather than allowing us to be rounded in our experience of the whole world. So he thinks that the overcoming of capitalism is necessary to fulfill a kind of freedom which is immanent, which is present within capitalism itself. My question for us is there a kind of freedom which is immanent to our world? Or, more pessimistically, is there something about Marx's 19th century world that meant that some kind of freedom was immanent to it? And perhaps something so ambitious as universal human freedom is not immanent to our world today?
Because that was going to be my third question, is so we've defined the moment of transition, the death that means the inheritance is necessary, and you've given this beautiful account of what that inheritance might be. What's the problem? Why is it difficult to be a good heir? And that surely is the question that you've moved to at the end there, which is, does a good heir have to be free of doubt? Does a good heir simply have to believe? Or could you be a good heir and actually raise that, frankly, vertiginous, scary kind of question, which is, but what if that 19th century promise was time-bound? And what if a stark, clear-headed, realistic, if I may say so, approach to 2026 leads one to really bleak conclusions? That surely is also one of to be an heir of a hopeful tradition. How does one have to situate oneself to do it justice and to be true to it? Also, presumably, a deep question for those people of faith as well.
Yes, this is exactly the thing I grapple with. So I think that the reason that the promise of freedom that so animated people from weavers in the 1840s to anti-colonial revolutionaries in the 1970s, which really was a belief that the world tended, that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, a belief that the whole world had within it the resources to overturn every system of domination and make people free everywhere. Freedom, not just in this limited kind of liberal sense of non-interference, but freedom to define oneself, and Nina Simone's kind of freedom, a feeling, an enduring condition. I think that the reason that became less believable is because it was utterly umbilically attached to particular historical subjects, to people.
Yes.
Who had an experience of unfreedom, workers who had an experience of capitalist exploitation, the colonized, women who had an experience of patriarchal domination. These oppressive experiences remain, but some of the texture of that experience that created the idea of its negation, the idea of a possible freedom, in Britain here, was attached at the beginning of the 20th century to miners who set up the Labour Party, formed our only ever general strike, nearly led us on another general strike in the 1970s, was attached then in the 70s to car workers, militant subjects. Well, both miners and car workers and the life worlds that were built around them are now gone. Yes. Britain still produces cars, but with far fewer workers doing it.
And also the foundation, right, the Archimedean point, the point from which they could exercise leverage was real.
Exactly.
Was very manifest. Cars, energy.
Exactly.
And so then what I hear you saying is that jointly at the same moment, both the agent of this project of liberation and the standpoint, or the sort of the point d'appui, the place on which they rest and stand, both of those feel destabilized in the current moment.
And connectedly.
Yes.
You know, I read neoliberalism as the concerted disassembly of emancipatory subjects.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's a project in destroying working class life worlds. That's why Thatcher had to go to war with the miners in Britain. They were the social subject that had grounded and been the kind of organizing core of socialist politics. Very inspiring when you see those old miners' banners and you see this idea of a kind of imminent freedom. You see people working in tough conditions, collectively, socially, we're both familiar with Tim Mitchell's work on carbon democracy, the importance of miners in creating even democratic cultures. So they had to be destroyed. Anti-colonial revolutionary projects had to be destroyed and defanged by the IMF and the World Bank. There was a concerted disassembly of emancipatory subjects, and so of the standpoint from which to imagine a possible freedom. And so the question for us is, in the rubble that we inhabit, what kinds of possible freedom can we imagine? And you're right, the challenge that comes, I think, to that attempt to rebirth a socialist or a communist politics, the challenge that comes from a kind of sharp, smart, realist liberalism, and I think a lot of our dialogue has been engaging with this challenge, is the question, well, is there any historical guarantee that there should be any concept of total human emancipation born within the mess of our present at all? And can we instead proceed with something less than that? So a question, I think that takes us to a question I want to ask you, which is, do you understand your project in being in dialogue with governments, even briefly with the Biden administration in America, in your interest in the politics of contemporary China and its state, its party, as being about an attempt to find resources of hope that might be resources of technocratic statecraft and are not a politics of universal human freedom? Do you understand? Do you think my bar is too high and you're trying to do something more gritty and realist by using existing power to make the world better?
I mean, setting me personally aside, I think that I'm very moved by the diagnosis of the fragmenting of the historic subjects of universal emancipation. And I think that's an incredibly powerful reality. I mean, my generation lived through that, this dismantling, and our entire identities and lives were shaped by that dismantling. And so I think, it's absolutely fair to say, and I'm also not somebody, and I think the vast majority of people of my ilk are not people of faith. We're not carried by the promise of any great emancipation. I think it's quite telling that there's been a revival of religion, as I understand it, in certain segments of the British upper middle class and professional class, because one feels the lack of it. If I may say so, it's quite profound, especially in the threat of AI and these technologies which now intrude directly into the realms of our own production. And so yes, I would agree. I think I'm quite attached to a more minimal kind of immanence, a more minimum kind of, okay, what is it that we can do from within? What is it that from within the current moment, however you define it? And that's then when the science bit comes in and you have to use whatever technologies of statistics or economic analysis or sociology or anthropology or whatever it is that you have at your disposal to map that terrain. What is it that we can do here that will be useful, that will make a difference in some sense, and a very provisional, in that sense, coping, a very provisional ameliorist project, very often in the current moment, because I'm very preoccupied with crisis, mere patching of a sinking ship or a boiler that's about to explode, like that kind of image of management, which has a historic legacy too, which goes back to a similar moment, because liberalism in its triumphant form was broken by the great catastrophe of World War I. And my reference point, and I think it's fair to say the archetype for folks operating at in the kind of political sphere that I'm interested in, is somebody like John Maynard Keynes, who very explicitly, exactly in the terms that you described it, tried to redefine a liberalism, a project of, it's not merely a technology of government. What's so impressive about it is that it's a technology of government defined in relation to the broader trajectory of democracy as we saw it, very much including the Labour Party, very much including the general strike, and not as a timeless universal project, but as a specific historical invention required at the moment where the old certainties of the 19th century had broken and contemporaries hadn't really, in his terms, understood the scale of the shock. And if there's one thing that his politics is committed to, it's the shaking people awake, not merely to apocalypse and the inevitability of it, but to the necessity to recognise how fragile the world is, and therefore the urgency of shaking off old superstitions and trying to control the bits which are controllable, which in his terms are things like macroeconomics and money and so on. And that I think is still very much, if you think about the climate question or issues like that, or the great shift in power from the West to Asia, that shaking awake, that effort to shake people, the mainstream conversation, out of the complacency that things are continuing on in the, say, the neoliberal mold of the last half century. And then, in the next step, thinking about what possibilities there might be for government, for action and as collectivities and with the instruments of power. That's for me the project. But we where you and I really intersect, and what has made our conversation so fruitful over many years now, is this common sense that both the agent and the standpoint are in the particular moment that we're in flux.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's grapple with that Keynesian politics. You see, it seems to me that Keynes is not a victor of the 20th century, that the future that he imagined at the end of World War I became a kind of future past. He says at one point in the 1930s, in Britain, for the rest of the century, ordinarily we'll have Labour governments. And he imagined, which of course didn't come to pass, and he imagined that the end of World War I forced him to reevaluate his politics of loyalty to the British imperial bourgeoisie in quite an interestingly limited sort of way. So before World War I, he had thought that the British capitalist class were agents of progress and could be trusted. He has an amazing example of the situatedness of his thinking. He makes before World War I his famous argument about higher rates of spending when you redistribute income to lower income groups, as an argument for not redistributing income to lower groups. He says, if poorer people have money, they spend it on ice cream today. If capitalists have money, they build railways. So in the 19th century, you can trust the capitalist class to make wise investments. That whole world is blown up by World War I.
Yep.
And he sees the idiocy of the British capitalist class and of its politicians. And it seems to me what he tries to construct is a politics that would shift those capitalists from the private sector to the public sector. That they should be running the British state.
Yeah, the direction of investment, to make it more concrete, should shift from, what are in the end feckless, irresponsible, short-sighted, conservative in the worst possible way, business elite in Britain, the hard-faced men that did well out of the war and the panicky people in the stock market, to some other body, which of course he imagines himself in charge of.
Well, precisely. So he wants the socialization of investment. There's a lot of the Keynesian project that's much more radical than post-war, what Joan Robinson called bastard Keynesianism. He wants the socialization of investment. He wants the state to be, he talks about a planned domestic economy even. But who does he want to be running that state? People like him, Etonians and others.
There's still that 19th century elitism that's completely unbroken in him. And, doesn't differentiate between working class people in trade unions, who we also think don't really have a clue, and business people who really have no excuse, but are also clueless. But
he even his early work on Indian currency and finance treats equal contempt for the Tory short-sightedness that would pillage India and Indian economics that wants national self-determination. No, he wants liberal, enlightened British statesmen to run Indians' lives for them. And I think he kind of domesticates that politics then when he thinks about the British working class. So there's a profound elitism. He says, of course, famously, the class war will find me on the side of the educated bourgeoisie. His goal is to stop that confrontation from happening.
So he doesn't have to make that painful choice, which he thinks is determined by his class background and by this attitude, by this affect of contempt, ultimately, because how could he be on the side of the TUC?
Is that is that a very limited kind of political project, really, is my question. In one sense.
It clearly is. And I think this is, I find those essays of Keynes in the 1920s and 30s both this is before he writes his famous economics book, which is The General Theory, which comes out in 1936, which I can't really recommend as light reading to anyone watching this show. But Essays in Persuasion, which are a collection of essays from the late 20s, are, anyone who reads the newspaper can digest and appreciate, I think, these texts. They're fascinating. But they are very limited politics. Yes, it's really a kind of late Edwardian kind of translated into the 20th century. And I think one would have to say that if you want to own this Keynesian legacy in some way, you take it to a very general level, at which case, far from being the losers of the 20th century, we're all Keynesian now, in some sense. Or you go, which I find even more attractive, to a position which says that Keynesianism went through successive iterations, and its most radical was really in the 1970s, because Keynesianism was dancing in what used to be a telephone box, right? It was operating within a very, very constrained circumstance. To be technical about this, it's operating within a currency system which, even if it is moving away from gold, is ultimately tied to the gold backing of the currency. And an underrated break in human history at the civilizational world historic level is in the early 70s, when all the major currencies of the world are separated from gold, something that he had long argued for because he's a strong conventionalist. Gold is no different than law, for instance, right? We shouldn't fetishize it as a substantive thing. And that opens up a realm of radical experimentation in economic policy, and then also new repressive efforts to shut that freedom down. And I think, in the same way as one would want to grant to Marxism, originally a theory of the mid-19th century, shaped, as you're saying, in the 1850s in the first encounter with Victorian industrialism, a afterlife which constantly innovates. Keynesianism can be, I think, seen as running along with it in some sense. And the smarter and stronger Keynesians are constantly, as liberals should really, and those who are worth taking seriously, have always done in the 20th century, measuring themselves against their serious intellectual antagonist, which is various types of updated Marxism. And so, to my mind, the Keynesianisms of the 1970s, which are actually embracing the options of a monetary order which is no longer tied to gold, are the ones which are truly attractive and interesting for us now. So that's where you're right that historic Keynes, in some sense, is a period piece and a rather limited kind of politics. But that's not where it stopped. I mean, to my mind, one of the most amazing essays in those collections of the 20s is where he says, liberalism will have a brilliant future if it could address, various technical issues to do with monetary policy, and, in addition, two questions, the drug question and the sex question. And if we can speak about drugs and sex, we're going to be in the political mainstream. And, you tell me Keynesianism lost in the 20th century, on the 21st century. No, he saw those questions and their centrality, and makes an emphatic democratic case for saying, if you think that, your average working class woman can't handle talking about sex, you haven't met any. You don't understand how central these concerns are. No one there is appalled about talk about abortion. We need to embrace and talk about this. And if you don't take seriously people's need for escape from mundane reality in various types of narcotics, again, you don't really understand life. And he was a man, after all, who understood the pleasures of life in complex ways. So that, I think, is another element of this new liberalism, shall we say, this reinvention of a 19th century tradition. And it's not just those particular claims, but that meta move in general that's interesting, right? That is saying, as history and times change, we need to continuously broaden. So I would think of ecology and the environmental politics, which again is a kind of liberal domain to a considerable extent from the 60s onwards, as the next frontier, which is why the humiliation and the modesty and the disaster in some senses of Western environmental policy, the failure really to grasp the climate problem with due force, is yet another disappointing iteration of this Keynesianism.
So you don't think that the crises of the 1970s involved various groups that Keynesians would hope to manage, whether that's workers with their pay claims or whether that's the colonized, saying that actually they didn't want to be managed, they wanted to take charge of the historical process?
Oh, I'm sure that's exactly what's happening, but the managers still get to do the managing thing, right? So then the question is, how are those two different visions of the world going to relate to each other? and neoliberalism exploited, and the right-wing truly conservative backlash exploited the breakdown of that relationship. So my liberalism is another, I think, crucial thought, and this is what's so interesting about Keynes, is he has hegemonic aspirations, but he fully understands that his world is highly confined. And that, again, is a kind of central position. So as much as, upper middle class educated people, of which I am the bona fide descendant, right, tend to think of themselves as the universal class. It's definitely not true. It's crazy, right? It's mad. It's a mad pretension. It can only be sustained at the idealistic level. Whereas the Marxian claim to constitute a universal out of material reality is far more compelling to me. So stuck in the position that folks like myself are in, the question then is, how do you do politics? And it has to be coalitional. It has to be. That's why I'm here. It has to be coalitional, right? In the complex coalition that currently is configured around Tribune, around folks like yourself. And that's something that Keynes understood. And it's about making those coalitions work. And that's what he's saying. If the coalitions break down and we end up on either sides of the barricades, this just goes to shit, because I'm going to end up shooting people on the other side that I actually want to be in coalition with. And that's what I see the 1970s as being, the breakdown of that coalition. And I'm not blaming the insurgents who are tired to hell of being managed by Keynesians by any means. Far more obvious, I think, is the fact that there's a surrender, essentially, by the professional middle class to the lure of neoliberalism, because though it wasn't our vision of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, did we do well out of it? By heck, we did over the last 50 years, right? So there's a kind of betrayal of a coalition on the part of the professional managerial class. People in the US refer to this as the PMC, right? Of that coalition. And yet, in liberalism's modern history, it has never, ever, ever achieved any of its major goals under its own steam. Right? It has always essentially relied on coalitions. And the problem from the 70s onwards is it ends up in coalition with story of the Labour Party. You end up in coalition with the City of London, right? You end up with the Tony Blair synthesis. And there's smart Keynesian technocrats all around, Gordon Brown and people I love and care about and doing the right thing. But de facto, they're in coalition not any longer with organised labour and the social democratic project of rebuilding Britain, but with the City of London. And we see the consequences of that after 2008, because you just can't get the wheels back on the bus.
Yeah, one way of thinking about the long crisis that we're in, that set in the 1970s and 80s, is that those emancipatory subjects that Marx imagined as having immanent within their experience of domination, a vision of a possible freedom, were too few in the global north. The miners and the car workers and young unemployed black men and women in inner cities were too few, and gay people being beaten up by the police, to constitute a collective subject that could claim hegemony in a society like Britain. And where they might have been in the majority in the global south, they were not strong enough in the face of global northern power, because the upper sections of that working class who bought their own council houses under Thatcher, and then sold them and moved to the suburbs, and then bought shares when Telsit was privatising infrastructure. The upper sections of that working class, the lower sections of the middle class, who were in alliance with the working class in the great 1951 election in Britain, where the Labour Party lost but got more votes than ever before because it won so many votes from salaried professional workers. Thatcher was able to break that coalition.
Well, don't make it so much a matter of sociology merely. It's a deliberate, I mean, this is brilliant, so Stuart Hall's analysis of Thatcherism, right? This is a deliberate project. Hegemony doesn't just consist of offering people treats and telling them good stories. It consists in breaking your enemies. And I don't think I would start by saying that coalition of working class power was weak. I would say it was very, very strong.
Right.
So strong that it necessitated a rearrangement of conservative politics, a whole bunch of really rather weird alliances in the US case between neoliberalism and outright neoconservatism. Evangelical right-wing politics end up in bed around Bill Clinton in the 1990s, things that don't go. Like Tony Blair is a bizarre phenomenon, of this kind of movement, a kind of conservative neo-theological politics in alignment with Keynesian managerialism. A whole variety of rather forced coalitions are necessary to block and stop. I'm not saying there was a revolution in the offing, but there was more movement, there was more scope for movement, and there was more countervailing power than at any point in the West since the immediate aftermath of World War II and the immediate aftermath of World War I. Right? So I think there were those three great moments. And in each case, the story, I think, shouldn't be, that Keynesianism or, Arthur Scargill's vision of the British Labour movement just sort of died a natural death and then neoliberalism took over. No, they were fought down. They were broken. They were victimized. Not victim. That makes them too passive as well. They were the objects of class struggle. And then, on the other hand, of course, there was the privatization campaign. So it was this double movement that was very powerful.
But didn't Keynes's vision, and of course, people on the left like to tout Mikhail Kalecki's famous 1943 challenge to Keynes on the politics of full employment, that Keynes's very ambitious vision required a kind of naivety about capitalist interests. His vision in the 1930s was more ambitious than the so-called Keynesian civilization that we got, because it involved not just redistribution. I mean, for one thing, it involved redistribution on a global scale. He wanted the World Bank institutions to be much more radical than they were. It involved redistribution and the socialization of investment, of banking, and at some points, negative money that decreases in value over time, so that people are disincentivized from hoarding. It becomes impossible to hoard money. So he imagined, therefore, the euthanasia, famously, of the rentier. I think of capitalism. I think Keynes does have a vision of the end of capitalism. If capitalism is capital accumulation, the moderation of his politics is not that he loves capitalism. It's that he loves the people who've run British capitalism, and he wants them to become loyal servants of the state.
He loves a certain idealized vision of the potential development of 19th century high Gilded Age Victorian and Edwardian upper middle class civilization.
Totally.
That is what he sees as what is worth preserving. In other words, the Oxbridge, he sees himself as the heir of Locke.
Explicitly, he says,
and that British intellectuality that goes back to the 17th and 18th century, and he wants to see that, a kind of, it's not neo-Elizabethan, but it's that kind of vision. And that is threatened by the circumstances of the 20th century, by the power of organised labour, which has a very different culture, in his view, perhaps no culture at all, really, and the even worse phenomenon, which is the horror of the British capitalist class, which is just brainless, headless. He talks for good reason about animal spirits, right? It's just swims one way or the other. So that is what he wants to rescue. But that is him, right? And I think that you can detach from him a politics of the reinvention of liberalism, the politics of a coalition with social democracy, which doesn't have to remain within the confines of that very particular Bloomsbury, Cambridge kind of version, though that has considerable cultural power. And Kalecki, though, is really, I can never remember whether it's Kalecki or Kalecki. I always get told off one way or the other by my Polish friends. His point is really fundamental and powerful, because what he adds back in is class struggle, right? What he adds back in is that it's not by accident that Keynes, the door to Keynesian interventionism opens when the capitalist class sees that it needs rescuing, right? That it sees it needs collective action. But no one should mistake that for a permanent alliance, right? Because as soon as something like full employment and normal profit and accumulation conditions are restored, you would expect those same groups to begin to worry about things they call euphemistically overheating. This is the thing you'll hear in central bank talk. The economy is running too hot. We need to cool it down. What they actually mean is we need to raise unemployment. And in America, we've even reached the point where racialized categories of unemployment are legitimately discussed in this context. So the question literally becomes, how high does the rate of male black unemployment have to be for us in the bond market not to worry about the economy running too hot? It's as explicit as that, because in their progressivism, the central bankers realized that the single most powerful indicator of the state of the economy was black male unemployment. Last in, first out. This is your indicator. And so that became the kind of nub of this Kaleckian struggle over the management of capitalism under conditions of tension. And as a kind of left Keynesian, I would say, well, yeah, fair enough, comrade, that's absolutely right. So we have to be attentive at those moments and push back and argue and find a new coalition and not just kind of rest on our laurels and go, hey, they love us because we saved them in 2008 and whatever, but keep the argument going, which is one of the reasons why I was willing to engage, or it wasn't really a choice on my part, why I was engaged by the Biden people. Because they seriously kind of left social democratic forces and the American Democratic Party wanted to learn lessons from the Obama administration. And I was one of the people that really synthesized the narrative of the disappointment of the Obama administration. And it centered on this question of how big did we go with the stimulus? How much is too much? And we literally enacted the entire Kalekian drama with people citing my work and others' work to say, under Biden in 2021, we should go really, the phrase was, we should go big. And they went big. We went big. Over, close to $2 trillion in stimulus. And what happened? Immediately, Larry Summers and co. emerged on the stage to say, what? You're overheating the economy. We need to cool things down. Whereas we had actually persuaded the Fed to look at black male unemployment as their key indicator of whether the economy was running hot or not. And the Fed managed this through. So then what came in its stead was the politics of uncertainty, the politics of the cost of living, the inflation crisis that were exploited mercilessly against that effort to rescue America from what in 2020 was a devastating social crisis. Folks in Europe don't appreciate just how dramatic the disintegration of American politics in 2020 was. Black Lives Matter, of course, surfaced, but that was, as it were, the epicenter of a much more comprehensive crisis in American politics, which culminated with Jan 6 and so on. So anyway, that is to my mind, my Keynesianism isn't, much as I appreciate, much as I'm a historian and much as I appreciate and love the deeply historical reading of what he was about, for it to be live at all and not just a sitting duck for criticism, it has to be this evolving meta-politics.
So I understand that there's you're drawing this important distinction, as you say, I'd want to do this with Marx, between a historical individual and a tradition.
And within that, then, as people do with Marxism, what Joan Robinson called the bastardized, as it were, the conformist form of Keynesianism, which slides well away from what Keynes himself said, back towards essentially conformity, to a mere managerialism,
demand
the smallest kind, to a third position, which is a kind of a Keynesianism which is radical. You insist as far as the end of capitalism. That's fine. I think his version of that is so weird that in some senses we're twisting him by saying that, because it's not really. Anyway, it's not a fully socialist vision, but it's certainly one of radical transformation. And that third position is the one I guess I would personally, for what it's worth, be most interested in.
He does in the 1930s call it a socialist vision.
Yeah, you're a text rat. You're like an archive rat, even far more than I am. You're an intellectual historian at some level, and I'm an economic historian.
You see, I have wanted to suggest that there's a kind of limit, a structural limit in the tradition,
yes,
which is a kind of managerialism that sees like a state.
There's like a bone in it. It's like a tasty meal with a bone in it, and the bone in the Keynesian dish is definitely this managerialism. You call it a structural limit.
Yeah,
I would say it's like a bone. It holds the whole thing together.
Yeah, I mean. In 1925-6, he goes to the Soviet Union and loves it.
Absolutely.
And he loves it because he sees what he regards as the great achievement of 19th century civilization, which is the ballet.
Yeah,
he's married a Russian
support for ballet. Yeah.
Exactly, he's married a Russian ballerina.
Yeah.
It would seem to me that in the crisis of the 70s, 80s, including in the downfall of the Soviet Union, people don't want to be managed, and that one of the problems is that managing people sort of works as long as it works, as long as you can deliver the goods. When you can't deliver the goods, if your only claim has been we're delivering the goods to you, what you've lost, which is the thing I'm interested in reviving in socialist and communist traditions, is a politics of freedom, of a hope in the transformation of human relations that isn't limited to we'll give you things. I guess I want to ask you, in that crisis moment of 2020, 21, what you think, if there was a missed opportunity, what you think an ambitious left Keynesian coalitional with socialist politics, let's say in that American emergency at the moment of Black Lives Matter and the pandemic, what could, and then the coming of inflation, which I know you think of very directly as a question of class politics, of distributional politics. Was there a project that was missed that what could have been done?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to hypothesize or speculate about this. It was the vision of the Green New Deal that emerged from the electoral breakthrough, slightly after Corbyn in the UK, that you were so closely involved with, after the midterm elections in the US, which are so important for the mood swings. Everyone should be watching out for this in the course of this year. By the time this show releases, this will be the key in the US. Because if the Democrats make a breakthrough, and in 2018 a left-wing faction within the Democrats made a breakthrough, folks will know Jacobin, Brooklyn, this kind of scene, that opened a window. And what it opened a window to, I think, is really very fundamental and fascinating, and goes to this question of the malleability and the openness of this tradition, which is a vision of the Green New Deal, which in the end, of course, ended up cut down Keynesianism style to nothing more than green industrial policy. As a result of very tough bargaining in Congress, right? American administrations don't govern the way the British governments do, with huge parliamentary majorities. But started out as the Green New Deal, which was a completely comprehensive vision for transformation of American society, which also answered the degrowth critique by saying, well, yes, we are going to do industrial policy for green energy and infrastructure, and America needs like proper modern railways, for instance, and we need housing. But centrally, and in its main focus, was orientated around a feminist politics of care, which was not presented as a sort of normative concession or to sort of woke, but as a realistic account of what the American working class consists of and what it needs, which is a public support for social reproduction. Because the crisis of the American working class is manifest and real, but it doesn't just consist of, as they like to put it, a shortage of good-paying blue-collar jobs. That's really the downstream of the more fundamental problem, which is the conditions of childcare, healthcare and elder care, and add a mental health crisis on top of that. And that's what the Green New Deal was about, right? It was for Europeans, because the politics of climate is easier here. In the US, the politics of climate were attached to this really comprehensive vision, which was in really big numbers. You were going to go big with this. It was trillions of dollars as a budget. Of course, American numbers always over 10 years, so a little less enormous than it first appeared, but macroeconomically relevant, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% of GDP, like big Cold War military spending, but on the transformation of American society. And that, had a Keynesian rationale. We could all do the math on the macroeconomics, and some people were terrified and other people delighted. But it, above all, refigured what it is that you were trying to do in American society. Would it have produced more growth? Most likely. Would it have reduced unemployment, especially for disadvantaged minorities? Most likely. But above all, it was also just changing the parameters of what we were talking about in economic policy to the things which so evidently matter to most people in their lives, at least at some point in their biography. And for all of us, at some point, some of these issues really matter. So that for me is like the concrete, the stuff I ended up doing, which was like, where I didn't really have much direct advisory input, but where I was cited and quoted and mobilized was again like a off on a different conversation, which was how big was the stimulus we can do in 21, which didn't have any of those elements. That was just checks handed out to people in terms of purchasing power. Again, Keynesians would say, okay, fine, we can live with that. That's the Keynesian analytic is rather unspecific as to what you spend the money on. If the aim of the game is just to stabilize the macroeconomic ship, then just get the checks out. As you were saying, money that decays over time will do the job. But in the back of that, there was this other project which really had a concrete vision for a really quite fundamental transformation of American society.
So climate politics for you becomes not something Keynesian in this narrow, worst sense of a pure managerialism where you can imagine, it was a Labour Party manifesto in 1945 that says the gentleman in Whitehall really knows in matters of nutrition and public health. One can think about a climate Keynesianism as the gentleman in Whitehall or in the Fed writing the checks and making the decisions.
Or Beijing.
Let's get there in a second. But you're talking about the Green New Deal as something more radical, both at the level of vision of the kind of society that's involved, and at the level of the kind of political subjects that are mobilized.
Yes.
I know we're both keen on Gabriel Wynant's work, where in America, a city like Pittsburgh goes from having workers in steel to having workers in healthcare, and that changes the gendered composition of the workforce, the racialized composition, and they're doing both productive and social reproductive work. How do you imagine then a climate politics activating particular kinds of political subjects beyond just the managerial elites?
Well, I mean, I think the climate politics is fascinating because it comes in so many different shades, and it also essentially poses the problem of priorities, and in a really disorientating way, because you can construct various types of ecological Marxism in the mid-19th century, and that's fair, and it's there and to be found. But broadly speaking, I think certainly my reading of Marx will be that it was a rebellion against the kind of Malthusian restraining kind of logic that said, really, we have more possibilities than... So Malthus was the late 18th, early 19th century theologian who basically damned the French Revolution as condemned to failure as a result of the inability of food supply to keep up with the fact that people after the revolution would have so much sex, they'd have so many babies, and we'd live in this theologically, ultimately God-ordained disaster of overpopulation and collapse, right? And Marx has no time for this. Marx is cognizant of the damage which capitalist growth is doing to nature, including, of course, the human body in some of the most graphic passages in Das Kapital. But broadly speaking, Marxism was an expansive kind of vision, cornucopian vision, or it could be read that way and was generally read that way. And then along comes this I don't want to call it neo-Malthusian, but this new sense of constraint, in some cases overtly neo-Malthusian, from the late 60s, early 1970s onwards. And it's really difficult to wrap one's head around, right? This is part, I think, of the challenge that we're trying to address, or you're trying to address in these series, is how do you then imagine the subject if you can't any longer presume just this endless abundance of greater and greater mobilization of natural resources? Sensibly, right? There's huge technological feats still ongoing, but we now cannot, if we're remotely serious people, ignore our best guess that this can't possibly be sustained. It's a vertiginous, utterly unprecedented, scientifically structured view, right? Never before have governments, after all, set out to promise their citizens, grandchildren, a livable planet. That's a new level of governmental ambition. It's absolutely necessary. I'm not by saying, oh, that's ridiculous, you silly, naive people, go away. No, that's part of the terrifying reality that we live in. We can't ignore the science. The science tells us what. So then from that spawn like endless different versions of environmentalism, right? Well, including a neoliberal version, which is the dominant form in the UK and in Europe, which is Keynesianism of the most sort of attenuated, evaporated, thinned out kind, which is we will design a market that will take care of this. That's a very Keynesian idea, actually, to design a market that takes care of this. But it's the most minimal. And the promise is you don't have to do any politics at all and you'll get to the right world, which turns out to be totally naive. It's a bit like saying regulating the money supply so as to control inflation doesn't involve any politics. It's the most first level bad faith move, because obviously who gets credit decides crucially in capitalism. Likewise, who gets carbon credits decides crucially where we move and what price the carbon credits are charged for. So that was one strand. Another version would be a flat out kind of developmental Keynesianism, kind of like, the National Coal Board, just green now. So we'll have a National Green Board and we'll do investment and we'll build out a national green energy system, which I would think of as sort of indispensable. I'm frankly also not against carbon pricing. I just think we should be clear about what its politics are. Because I'm a Keynesian and I just am wide open on the different instrumentalities that we use, but I think we should be clear about politics. And then the third, you're absolutely right, the Green New Deal in the original American version does imply the very self-conscious construction of a new subject. And part of that, of course, is legacy American civil rights politics going all the way back to the 1960s. Part of that is the Rainbow Coalition of people like Jesse Jackson from the 1980s onwards. And then there's this new definition of climate exposed, environmentally at risk groups, which comes out of the environmental justice movement in the US. Also rather stronger in the US than in Europe from the 1980s onwards because of the so stark hierarchies of environmental risk between especially black communities and the rest of the the rest of the white population in so-called Cancer Alley in Louisiana. There are just these sacrifice zones, largely black populations, which have just been subject to huge risk. You put all of that together and you get this idea of frontline communities. And the frontline communities are one of the things which AOC, the radical representative from New York, and her kind of brains trust formulated as an idea of this new agent, this new subject of progressive politics. And unfortunately, it was torn apart, that vision. So it totally conforms to your broader scheme, is that we have the capacity to imagine actors like this, and no one should ever admit the argument that that's utopian merely or some exercise in naivety. No, because that's actually a better description of the American working class than the one that actually came out of this by 22-23, because it is comprehensive and diverse and complex and largely in the service sector and not necessarily terribly material intensive. But it is not currently, in its current configuration, as politically powerful as the narrow interests of those who are mobilizing key swing states and key swing districts around the members of the United Auto Workers or the prospect of reindustrializing Ohio. So you end up with these, in their own terms, close to denialist kind of visions of saving the American working class by building chip factories, which it just doesn't add up. A couple of thousand people in a chip factory. The problem with the American working class is problems of tens of millions of people who can't afford what for a rich society should just be the basics of affordable housing, healthcare, transport, elder care.
In the 1980s in Britain, the feminist Anna Coote said the key question is not how do we reindustrialize to secure full employment, but how do we care for and support our children?
I think, and it is utterly mind-bending to me that just doesn't cut through. Like it's really telling that it has as little purchase. In the UK, at least there's elements of an infrastructure of childcare, but practically no society on earth, let alone any rich society, spends as little on childcare as the United States. And that this doesn't, public money that is, private level, of course, there's all manners of self-provisioning, just exorbitant and extraordinary costs for families in a city like New York, which is where Mamdani, of course, gets his momentum from, a real social crisis. But I find that wholly convincing as an optic on the impasse of democratic politics under capitalist conditions in the US right now. Yeah.
So is there a very broad politics, I might even say, of a kind of freedom imminent that emerges out of the experience of climate catastrophe, which is, rather than a story of industrial progress, a claim like capitalism has broken and destroyed the world, is breaking and destroying the world. And we want to repair what's broken. We want to care for people who are abandoned by deindustrializing, never fully post-industrial capitalism in the global north. Is there a class politics that assembles people abandoned, people declared surplus to requirements, for quite a radical vision of, what's sometimes called degrowth, instead of the obsession that we now have from the British state with the idea that returning to mid-20th century or even mid-2000, first decade of the 21st century growth rates is the only way to make anything better. Can we think about politics beyond that obsession with growth?
Well, to just the first part of your question, there was such a project, had a name, it had a life, it had a beginning, had an end, and it was broken and it lost in the struggles of 2021, 2022. You
mean the Green New Deal?
The Green New Deal, yeah. And that was that kind of politics. I want you, credit where credit is due. That was really quite powerfully formulated precisely that position. And on its left wing, it was also anti-imperialist. And the only people that spoke up against the increasingly evident hawkish turn towards China of the Biden administration in 2021 were not the Greens in Germany or people like that, but the Squad, who's 2 times made an effort to block what they saw was the escalating sort of military-industrial appropriation of the green energy agenda in 21. To add to their eternal credit, saw this and said it out loud.
Talking about left-wingers in the US Congress.
Yeah, left-wing in the US Congress, yeah, the squad. That's a tough position to be in. Those people have to be brave, and they face just vituperative assault and are sustained by communities of voters who are willing to bear the price of the marginalisation that goes with voting for those people. So so that isn't an abstract question. Like, I don't have to imagine it. It was there and it was defeated, but it was real. And I think of Mamdani and the remobilisation in New York as another iteration of an attempt to bootstrap that kind of politics. On the degrowth agenda, I mean, my only problem with degrowth really is the label and the political question of how you do it, how you get there. Like, it seems to me, I mean, evident that for rich societies, which by any reasonable standard have already reached, per capita levels of affluence that satisfy the conditions of freedom and flourishing, the central priority is no longer aggregate average growth, which can be wholly misleading because of inequality, dramatically so in the US. And the priority should all be about quality of life, distribution, the basic infrastructure of social reproduction, the mobilization of both the workers and the clients, customers in that relationship. That's clear, right? And as you say, like, why would you not mount a democratic politics around that central question of how do we care? I would say both for our children and our elders, and how do we care for people with illness and mental health? Like, those for me are like, you answer those questions, and like we're for real. The problem is, and nor is it like debatable, that in societies in Europe, overwhelmingly, the rates of growth now are so small that you have like Rachel Reeves huffing and puffing about 0.8% per annum, or the Germans going to 0.5. And these are barely measurable numbers, which are rounding errors in statistics, which they mean something, but they're not supposed to mean something at that level. No serious economic statistician is going to say I'm going to die on the hill of whether it was 0.5 or 0.8% growth. It's ludicrous. So it's a reductio ad absurdum. I mean, they're making themselves a laughingstock by engaging in this. That's clearly not what. The reason why it matters, however, is that clearly tens of millions of people in Britain have experienced declining real living standards and are really hard up and struggling. And the cost of living in a city like London, even for somebody from New York, is completely eye-watering, and something needs to be done about it. And they just reach for this old formula of like, well, growth is the answer, and it's clearly not. But then the question is, how do you build a coalition on the double side? Like, how do you? It's the hegemonic project. Like, you've got to build your own coalition, formulate the alternative, and on the other hand, silence the other side. Right? This has got to be a politics of power. It can't be a politics. For me, one of the real, kind of ambiguous turns of the just transition talks into the 2010s, which came out of the labor movement all over the world, in the US and South Africa, is that a just transition cannot be a politics that leaves the no one behind. We've got to leave some people behind. There has to be a hard-edged politics of coalitions. In democracies, you don't need 100% consent. You need a solid majority that sustains you to push through radical change, which changes the distributional bargain. And your claim has got to be, at some level, that broadly speaking, that's just justifiable on some calculus that applies to a broader group. Otherwise, you're really engaged in a kind of sectarian politics. But that is the problem of power is the central question, right? And that's a question that has to be posed at the level of three levels, I would say. Electorally, whatever your electoral system is, you have to play it and you have to win it. And the Democrats are shit at it, and we suffer the consequences. In Britain as well, we're staring at this reality after the local election results of 5 parties, all between 16 and 26%, with a first-past-the-post system. Like, it's a recipe for randomness, right? So you've got to win. You've got to build political economy coalitions, so interest groups, and then you have to get at the technocracy. You have to get at the inside levers of power. And Corbynism had elements of that kind of project, as you well know. And but that's when we say degrowth, it's got to meet that standard. And currently it doesn't, right? And the politics is very often formulated in a rather nakedly normative terms. And I don't have a lot of patience for that, because I think it also, because it's formulated as an empty normativity, it can often appear detached from reality, and that doesn't do the cause any good. Like, we can't afford to appear out of touch with the reality. And the problem is it leaves the scene to people like Reeves, who are going to celebrate 0.8% growth, which is clearly not. You see what I'm saying? We're caught in a kind of bad, it's not really even a dialectic, we're caught in a bad standoff between a politics of degrowth, which isn't really a politics, and a politics of growth, which isn't really a politics either.
Yeah, I think I would just think of the assembly of subjects, of interest groups into a kind of coalition as involving trying to leave behind capitalists, as involving trying ultimately to leave behind those people who exploit and expropriate.
It's a dangerous thing to do. And the successful programs of transformation have generally involved coalitions with some capitalists. So you have to pick your partners, and you have to find the weak spots, and you have to find the good victims. And coal, for instance, this is the strategy, the hard-edge strategy of climate, is that around 2021 on the Glasgow COP, for all of its razzmatazz and Boris Johnson and Mark Carney and all of the mobilization of $133 trillion of finance, the hard-edge thing was that a bunch of NGOs and a bunch of activists realized that coal is a sitting duck. And insofar as Britain has really made decarbonisation, of course, it is the politics of coal, and it's the destruction of the NUM in the 1980s, which opened the door in Britain to this ruthless, private, big corporate-driven offshore wind. It isn't even British companies that are plugged into the unbundled, privatised British electricity system. And so it's a very rapid decarbonisation by global standards. But it is also on the against the backdrop of that. This isn't neoliberalism as a technocracy. This is neoliberalism's class war, as we were saying.
Yeah, exactly.
The destruction of the blocking Labour coalition. Compare and contrast with Germany, notionally the great leader of green politics in Europe, nowhere near as far down the decarbonisation route. And part of it is the rearguard action of a really small group of mine workers who've delayed and forced a massive delay in. So I don't think of either of these as models. But that's what I would think of as being instructive in terms of thinking about this coalition that you're talking about. Where are this is a really underrated fact. In 2016, when Trump came back into power, you could have bought the entire coal sector in America for less than $1 billion because all of the major coal actors were bankrupt. So you could have just nationalised them for peanuts. I mean, this is, after all, part of the politics of the British Labour government after 45 as well. They picked the easy targets, which were failing industries in the 1920s and 30s, and you nationalise those. The risk, of course, is you end up then in public ownership of bankrupt businesses. So, but if the aim of the game is actually to shut them down, that's the moment to strike, because you're not, this isn't, like as Andreas Malm would say, the spectacular transaction that is involved in the emancipation of slaves against compensation. The coal mines are, the market is telling you, worth nothing. So nationalise them at that moment and shut them down.
But then you could think of coal miners as increasingly actually being declared surplus to requirements.
Then of course the constructive politics begins of how you then work with those communities.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it depends what sort of mining you're talking about. It all becomes very technical because we think of mining as 1980s pit mining, but of course modern mining is open cast. It's massive. There's hardly any workers involved. It's so gigantic in its scale.
And the question then becomes, rather than how do we construct a hard-edged climate politics that leaves behind miners, how do we, including in places where people have been mining for a long time and where their communities are being devastated, construct a politics that gives people a future.
Absolutely. And that exactly, a better future.
Yeah. And a better one than a future that involves destroying people's lungs and,
Well, healthier, yeah. I mean, this is again the kind of material politics of climate, like the major drivers of climate damage are ultimately also air polluting. And like in the West, these things become separated because of the chronology, because we deal with the most grievous air pollution, which was smog in a city like London. People were dying literally as a result of intense smog, and in China, of course, all the way down to the very recent past. But we deal with it early in the West, so climate becomes this abstract, remote, perfect for neoliberal colonization. It's the reason why people like me love it, because it's the most abstract problem you could possibly imagine, right? It's like gaming the development of the global economy in terms of CO2 metrics and modeling it that way. And that's part of also its democratic deficit as a politics. It's really hard to get from climate models to anything anyone immediately cares about, except if you're living right next to a coal-fired power station and you can see your child is dying from asthma. And the entire place, my mum grew up in Sheffield, like the entire place is caked with coal dust.
I wonder then if, alongside Keynes, we know another very different 20th century model for thinking about political subjects and reinventing socialism, which is Lenin.
Yeah.
And one of the differences, Lenin faces the historic crisis of a certain kind of Marxist optimism in the labour movement in places like Britain, ascending gradually until it reaches such strength that it can overthrow capitalism. He faces instead a labour movement in places like Britain split apart by imperialism. And he reimagines a political subject that includes peasants in Russia, workers in Britain, and colonized peasants too in India and China.
Chinese nationalists.
Chinese nationalists, Sun Yat-sen, and
and he sees that world, right? He's one of the first modern thinkers of the global condition, of what we call globalization, and a rather flat sociological term, and he sees it much more dramatically, and he realizes the weight of Asia in that story as well.
So he rethinks the sort of space of politics away from a Western-centric nationalist. Exactly. And he also rethinks the time, because he has a sense of the coming of catastrophe in World War I, and it's not just a linear story of progress. He's trying to think a possible politics that emerges out of the agency of people subordinated and dominated by a capitalist world system, rather than emerging from the standpoint of state technocrats and asking who can we bring into our coalition and who can we... Is there a...
Or emerging pure, fully formed as the universal class, that is the proletariat.
As one single universal class.
As the 1848, the kind of Marxist vision of that phase.
Exactly.
Yeah, he's so... I mean, just in my middle book, my third book, which is my toughest book, I think, I was absolutely struggling with Lenin, because it is so... struggling from my standpoint, because it is so incredibly compelling. And he writes this stuff like blog posting. It's like he's the first Substacker. If you read his, if it comes to us that way, because if you read his works online at Marxist.org or whatever, you can literally read him day by day writing the most brilliant political blog ever composed in real time. It's completely...
It's conjunctural analysis.
It's conjunctural analysis. It is in medias res, as in the middle of things, written from the middle of things, but constantly searching for the structure. I mean, I think Keynes and, well, for me the three are Lenin, Keynes, and Schmidt. I mean, the German conservative. Of course, one shouldn't worship these individuals, because there are, Gramsci in the Notebooks is doing something similar. Bukharin, in fact, anticipates Lenin.
Totally.
There's Hobson before. But there's a milieu of commentary which in these figures reaches... Well, they're in our situation. We not for nothing, we model ourselves on them, because we're in the same soup that they're in 100 years down the line.
So Lenin in 1912-13 finds that Europe is now, he says, going to just experience the reverberations of developments in Asia.
Amazing,
You are someone who has understood that world historic provincializing of Europe within world capitalism.
I'm trying to live it, absolutely. I'm trying to, learning Chinese every day. I spent an hour this morning,
But if the Keynesian hope might be what kinds of managers can one find in China, as he once found them in the Soviet Union, who can smooth over the social problems of our world. The Leninist hope, of course, was in revolution that entangled China and Russia and Britain. So it's a different...
put Mao back in the picture. Sorry, but yes, absolutely. I mean, Mao, after all, is not Lenin in the sense that he is even more in medias res than Lenin, right? He is in the middle of the struggle. So
I want to ask how your liberalism engages China now and thinks about the peripheral position increasingly of places like Britain and even America, because there are two kinds of obvious liberal reactions to the rise of China. One is to double down on claims that liberal democracy involves voting once every few years and various kinds of civil liberties, and perhaps even the freedom to organize trade unions, though there's not that much of that in Britain, but there's more of it than there is in China.
The consequences of butting up against that in China are more grievous.
Right. So there's a terrified view that the end of Western civilization is going to be the rise of something much worse, and that we'll come to appreciate the limited freedoms that liberal democracy has afforded in the West. And then there's another liberal view that I think is in some sense the more Keynesian liberal view, that is delighted by what seems like a more efficient technocratic management of the state in China than has been possible in the West for a long time. There's a question of whether that's true or a kind of racist image of sort of Chinese efficient calculating machines. Is that the Orientalism of the Orient? But there's a kind of adulatory liberalism about China, as well as a highly terrified liberalism about China. And you're, I think, sometimes associated with that adulatory position.
Yeah, right? No, people get me. Or in the other one, in other words, that I'm actually just a naive fellow traveller of a repressive regime.
Right.
So both.
Right. No, that's what I mean. That's the.
No, well,
that's
they're
the
both. Like one I get accused of like not understanding the in their own terms technically deficient Chinese solutions, and on the other being like willfully blind to the repression and the violence, or indeed even the payoff the Chinese regime. And I just find it. I'm not a big one for historical analogies, as you know, because I'm so interested in just the protean force of change. But nevertheless, I mean, friends, we have been here before, and there are things we can learn from how one navigates this kind of space. And the obvious analogy is obviously to Stalinism and the 1930s and the Popular Front moment and the struggles that intellectuals, progressives around the world went through in that moment in defining their position, including my grandparents. And the choices they made, of course, have echoed through my life, which was to side with the Soviet Union and indeed commit themselves to its power and its project.
To spy for it.
To spy, yeah. My grandfather was a KGB asset, and it's just such. It's it makes me so impatient because it's just such poor thinking on both sides. And it's also so blind to actual Chinese history, China's own history. Because you moved, but I wanted to insist on Mao so much, right? Because what's so striking about the Chinese Revolution is they, of course, see the Soviet Revolution and its deformation under Stalin. And Mao's entire politics in the 50s, 60s and the Cultural Revolution is about specific, well, both diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and the threat of Soviet invasion, and B, the analysis that one has to fight against bureaucratization and the which leads to this protean, catastrophic, violent, and yet also transformative process of the Cultural Revolution, without which you can't see or think amongst modern China. And that's where we're going to start from, right? And we're not going to indulge in a kind of this kind of external liberalism that says, oh my God, they don't respect freedoms in the same way we do. Or on the other hand, like, aren't their high-speed trains fantastic? For heaven's sake. So yeah, my engagement is trying to develop a practice of engaging with China, including with the regime, of a deep immersion in the undergrowth of Chinese oppositional culture, which one has to talk about carefully because of the people involved, which for me serves as a constant internal check on my technocratic enthusiasm. I don't think an internal check on, given my family's past, on the repression, and it's barbarous, and I don't have any illusions about how somebody like me would end up faring in a system like that, right? And I think that's not because I glorify myself as a dissident. It's just I see what it does to my analogues there and the choices they have to make. And if you don't want to end up as a dissident, what you have to constantly navigate and walk that line. And so, no, the bigger project is to try and understand this as this absolutely radical new stage of this project we've been talking about. We start in the 1850s, as you did at the beginning of our conversation, and we go through the crisis of the 1970s, which of course were far more violent and transformative and existential in China than anywhere else. And out of that, to put it really crudely, comes the victory, yes, of the hard developmentalist wing of the CPC, right? Development is the hard truth, is Deng Xiaoping's key thing. Not, I love Western markets, or the rule of law, or pluralism, or opening up, but Development is the hard truth. It's literally what Stalin says to the factory managers in 31, 32. Either we do this or they crush us. That is what Deng Xiaoping is echoing, right? And everything that comes after that is a continuation of that logic, that without development, you are at the mercy of other forces. And all the opening up that happens, no one in the West should exaggerate the extent to which that was really a comprehensive surrender, or the willingness of the CPC, the Communist Party, to invent itself, to course correct against what they see is the subversion of the autonomy of the party under the gigantic socioeconomic transformation that they've unleashed. So they are, in my view, the latest innovators in the party form as a form of political power, which is quite distinct from liberals and models in the West, where we have political parties that take turns to govern. Or somebody like Keynes would say, I'm far too, I think, proud a person not to belong to a party. Like I'm a party man and I'm a liberal, but that's not what being a member of the CPC means. And I think one could draw analogies there to Modi and the BJP and RSS as the kind of foundation of that kind of project, or Erdogan's AKP in Turkey, all of which emerged from the fires of real struggles for power, hard-knock struggles, and have innovated forms of, well, they're not democratic strictly. I mean, AKP and BJP are different, but they're plebiscitary. They enjoy absolutely mass support. They're hegemonic in their aspiration, for sure. These are not merely repressive, sort of minor totalitarian experiments. They are transformative national projects which involve a reconfiguration of the relationship with the state. And then, yes, let's talk about the railways. But only within the context of understanding what that choice was about. The railway choice in China was made in 2008, 2009 against the backdrop of what they understood as this epic screw-up in Western capitalism, this collapse of Western leadership in the world economy, and very explicitly, you see it said out loud, the realization that major economic crises are followed by major surges in technological innovation. And again in modern history, and they literally do the math, China has missed out on these opportunities. And this one, they are not going to miss out on, because that is the root of their subordination. So they see this as a sovereigntist project. That's what those railways are about. They're about building dominance in a certain sort of technology and outplaying the Europeans and the Japanese who are competing there. And that's also true of green energy. So those solar panels are not just just an achievement of green energy. They are a statement of this project. And yes, also, as many critical anthropologists and sociologists will tell you, they are claims on the territory of Xinjiang. They are claims on the Gobi Desert. They are projects of incorporation of Inner Mongolia into this multi-ethnic Chinese state.
So am I wrong that 20th century ways of thinking about politics are in a kind of crisis now? Because in fact, is Chinese capitalism, is it state capitalism or is it not? Is it the return of central ideas of the nation, the state, development that were 1950s Stalinist ideas? And is the postscript only of a Western centrism to a civilization that's just sort of moving its center, where the choice we face in somewhere like Britain is whether we're going to leash ourselves, chain ourselves to a decaying petro-state in America, or be servile instead to an electrification state in China, which is also doing a lot of coal-fired power stations, but has a vision of state power, controlling markets, but involving markets, allied to electrification rather than to the fossil fuels that are running out.
I mean, comrade, I would just simply say uneven and combined development. Both things are true at the same time, right? So they're both true at the same time in that, broadly speaking, to speak of a postscript as far as India, Turkey, China is concerned is vastly premature. They've only just started. They're just opening the second century of Chinese communism, and they mean that for reals. At the same time, I think you're absolutely right in your diagnosis of the situation of the West. And what we need to understand is that whereas once, you could think of, the British general strike of 26 sends ripples through the Communist International, major strategic reassessments on the part of leaders of the Comintern. Britain will no longer have that kind of relevance. Does that for the 60-odd billion people who live on this island mean that it's relevant? No, of course not. It's just a local, it's a local problem with intense local significance. And of course, because of its history, a wider appeal and a wider interest, and it becomes microcosmic and fascinating. And in the case of the Europeans and the Americans, equipped as they are with very, very powerful levers of power, I mean, that crisis matters to everyone. Right? America's crisis is to an extent everyone's crisis. But at the same time, yes, there is a project in Asia. The only hesitation there would be I'd urge you not to think of that as the extension of the 20th century, our history, right? We really need to open ourselves to new categories, new chronologies, and also, of course, to the internal critique of that project, because for, many, tempted to say most, right-thinking, Chinese, critical, intelligent people that I know, there is a profound disappointment that this should be the outcome, right? This was never, and I think you were telling me about Hobsbawm's famous response to Ignatieff, right? People can see this on YouTube where Ignatieff doing the liberal is kind of challenging him on his view on Stalinism. And Hobsbawm says, do you even think this was, only the most naive thought this was actually the socialist paradise. Yeah. Those of us who thought hard thought of this as necessary and better than the alternatives and essential as a lever against fascism, which meant the end of the world. And that is the spirit in which I approach Chinese green technology, not in the sense that, one sort of surrenders to CPC logic. Apart from anything else, it's such a nationalist project, you can't even, I said this in the LRB lecture, you can't become, if you wanted to be its fellow traveller, they're not accepting offers. Right? It doesn't operate that way. The Chinese Communist Party in its current iteration is not the Maoist party of the 60s.
So what are the parameters for a future politics, in your view, that understands the decline of American power, that doesn't seek desperately to arrest it, which seems to be the only thing that European states are interested in doing at the moment, shoring up NATO, hoping that their Western alliance can remain. What are the contours of an alternative politics that doesn't lament the decline of Western civilization, sees the move in the center of gravity, isn't so starry-eyed about China because they're building lots of railways, but is more connected instead to those kind of new left critiques within China. Is there a kind of alternative horizon there?
Well, I'm smiling at you in part because you know that when you say, what is the framework? For me, Europe is the only conceivable space in which that could be realised. This is not wholeheartedly and unapologetically endorse like everything the current EU in its existing form stands for. But or to put it another way, the UK in existing form cannot be a meaningful unit of that kind of project, right? It just, and that becomes more evident by the day, I would argue. And you might say that's maybe not the priority, but if you ask me like where that space for an alternative politics, and I took it in the spatial direction, which was one of the options you opened up earlier on, that certainly is where I invest my heartbroken hopes, is in that project. And then I do think it's a kind of new type of pick and mix. It's following again the template of 1920s Keynesianism, before its solidification into the general theory and technocracy in the 50s and 60s. It is a question about what is agenda and what is not agenda, and how do we articulate those elements. And this entire conversation we've been having about how you find coalitions, how you build powerful coalitions around key projects of the most urgent kind. And for me, in recent years, that's been thinking about climate change and the energy transition, but I would strongly suggest that obviously needs to extend to a variety of other domains. And I know one of the areas where you and I differ most deeply around the EU is immigration policy and the ghastly Fortress Europe policy that the EU pursues, to which I would want to counterpose a Keynesian politics of investment. In this comprehensive sense, so as to reduce the zero-sum, in other words, to provide a context in which one can handle racism and xenophobia in a more constructive way, because you you alleviate the distributional struggles which provide rocket fuel for the xenophobes and the racists. And I'm out and proud on that, and I think there should be it is one of the great and outstanding challenges for Europe, whether narrowly conceived as EU or Britain. Our relations with Western Asia and Africa are the frontier of a challenging politics of the future, and that has to go hand in hand with greater openness, a consistent struggle against racism, tacit or otherwise, and this comprehensive politics of sustainable living that we've been talking about.
You see, here I actually think we get to the nub. Because one of the differences between Keynes and Lenin, Lenin says everyone should read Keynes's Economic Consequences of the Peace, his denunciation of the Versailles Treaty. And Lenin says, because if you read it, you'll become a Bolshevik, even though Keynes wasn't himself. Because Lenin says Keynes has documented the savagery with which the victorious powers behaved at the end of World War I. Keynes, of course, thinks that there's this very open contingent space that those states could do otherwise. And Lenin has a much more fixed account of how European capitalists will behave. And I think it's there in that idea of Europe as something recoverable. You know, to me, Europe originates, the very idea of Europe is like the most violent idea in world history. And it's no coincidence that a European Union is oriented as a fortress, is oriented in a common agricultural policy to impoverish African farmers. It has a neo-colonial relation to its own internal periphery, to Greece and Italy and Ireland even. And I think there was a moment at which you sort of grappled with that and came out on the right side, as far as I'm concerned, which is in grappling with the genocide in Gaza, where Western civilization shows the scale of its brutality with support from the Biden administration writing the checks, who you had previously sort of talked to before this moment, with support from, of course, the whole political establishment in Germany. And, you know, some people read it, some critics on the American right, I think implicitly see the violence in Gaza as a sort of Jewish problem. Others read it as, I read it as not a Jewish problem, but a Western civilization problem, reiterating Theodore Herzl, founder of Zionism, wrote admiringly to Cecil Rhodes, reiterating the great British colonist of Southern Africa, great not in a nice sense. To me, the violence written into an idea like Europe is there in the killing fields of Gaza, and you, a liberal, chose to say, okay, most of the liberals are doing something barbaric in supporting this genocide or being silent about it.
It's really interesting, because I think my response would be that, I mean, you posed it, just to paraphrase, as a Jewish problem or a Western civilization problem. I don't know why you don't just simply say it's a political problem. And that would be my position. I understand that Western civilization is continuously invoked to justify appalling terror and violence, and has historically been. But that's only one use of the term and only one possibility in its development. And the same is true for Europe. And I guess I'm fairly committed to a project of transformation and fungibility and change and openness. That, however, also, and this is what we're seeing in Israel, can also, of course, include terrifying escalations towards ever greater levels of violence. And that's, after all, what we've seen in the Zionist project in the last 20 to 30 years, with Netanyahu emerging as this is in no way to downplay the fact that it was a settler colonial project from the beginning, and those are commonly, if not always, violent because of their inherent logic. But nevertheless, let's just grant that Gaza is a whole new level of absolutely manifest up there destruction. In the same way as I would say, you know, in the green technology placed a bet on the fungibility of energy technology, and we got Chinese solar, we also got fracking. Okay? You know, if we believe in this kind of openness of history, then we have to credit the possibility of total disaster, which is clearly where we're at. And but I don't do that from a kind of deterministic point of view. I do that from a kind of constant contingency, a matter of constant choice. So for me, since it's very difficult for me to meaningfully dissociate myself from Western civilization, I think of it as a kind of everyday project of it not being bad. Like it's an everyday project to wake up and be a decent human being, to not be a sexist, racist horror, to listen to critiques when they happen and to take them seriously. And in this case, it wasn't hard. This was an opportunity to totally fail, and it was crucial not to fail. Not in any very dramatic way, and I don't ascribe to myself any degree of, it was just like not failing, right? People say it's brave. Bullshit. It's just not failing. Do not fail at this moment of critical judgment where whether or not you can tell the difference between disaster and something in any way defensible is just the Germans say after hand, like it's right there in front of you. So that for me is the whole thing. We were talking about it. Like, if politics is always the weighing of means and ends, that never stops. And of course, I recognize as a historian of World War II, and an appreciator of the work of somebody like David Edgerton, I recognize in the particular type of war that Israel was fighting in Gaza, even to call it a war, the operation they were conducting, the distinctive hallmarks of what I've called liberal militarism, right? This is standoff militarism, where you demonize and the enemy. You basically establish a logic where any casualty on your side is excessive, and that then justifies any amount of violence to suppress the opponent, who in their unreasonableness is endlessly confirming that they deserve to be destroyed. So on. Like, no one in Britain can distance themselves from that, because that is the war that we waged from around here against Germany in the later stages of World War II. And in that context, I don't disapprove of it. I own the violence, and I don't think we should disapprove of it. You can make judgments about whether it was a reasonable way of using those resources or putting...
In World War II.
In World War II.
Not in Israel and Gaza.
No. But it's a matter of judgment. Like, in the struggle against fascism, do I believe in machines that kill fascists? Yes, I believe in machines that kill fascists. In Gaza, we're talking about the illegitimate imposition of a settler colonial project that dates to the late 19th, early 20th century, in the 21st century, and we say no. Full stop. No, not in my name, not with my support, not with my tax dollars, not with my acceptance, and not with my approval. Nor will I be silent and just sort of stand by.
But World War II is a kind of dangerously powerful image because it's so exceptional.
Yes, but it is it is. But when you say Western Civ, if you're looking at when you say, and this is our kind of war, that's the genealogy.
It just so happened that the British Empire in World War II and French imperial power, conscripting lots of colonized people it then didn't want to free, happened to be fighting something that most of us now regard as so thoroughly even worse that we can now affirm that war, even though at the time,
of course... You say happened, I would say not by accident.
Not by accident?
No.
There was something written to the logic of Western civilization that meant that Britain was better than Germany and fought Germany. I mean, there was
something written into the logic of historical development that placed fascism and Nazism in the relationship to British imperial liberalism that they were in the 30s and 40s. That was in no way by accident. And it is the derailment of the more radical project of democracy in the Weimar Republic and its backlash shift. I mean, we could do 3 more episodes on this. But no, I don't buy the accidentalism at all, because that justifies, in your case, the kind of, you enclose World War II in a little bubble and say, well, that's the good war, the last good war, and Brits shouldn't argue with the last good war. And in terms of the political health and the culture of Britain, it would probably be better if we did forget World War II, because it makes people sick, saccharine sick. But I was going the other route. I was going the Bomber-Harris route.
Yeah, sure, I understand.
Which is actually to say, no, what I see in Gaza is something which meets your standard of Western civilization. This is precisely the kind of war. But in my reading, Western civilization comes with the imperative to make political choices and moral choices associated with those politics. It doesn't guarantee that you get it right or you get it wrong, and all too often and throughout, as long as that term has been in use, it has more often than not opened up the door to disaster. But that doesn't mean that that's a useful way for thinking about what that disaster is there at that moment.
But I think that there's a pretty thoroughgoing continuity in this thing called Western civilization from...
There are continuities within it, yeah. It's multiple, it's braided, it has many different facets. But there is undoubtedly, I'm agreeing with you, there is one continuity that leads to that. But frankly,
I think
you'd have a hard time. Think of the last group of settler colonials that did a Gaza. Not really in the full view of the global press with...
I think it's
really
exceptional and extraordinary, the scale of the savagery in Gaza. But
it's unusual in part because it's so self-discrediting. You'd think, in light of those continuities, like somebody in the PR department will be saying, this is enough, this has got to end.
Unless if you can secure the support of the White House, the PR doesn't matter so much.
Which makes this not just generic Western civ, but something else, something more complex.
Well, I think so. There's a danger in flattening out the conjuncture with all of its many things going on into one story. But the reason I want to prize out one story is because I think that the kind of black box of Keynesianism might be the structural limits.
You want to put a black box of Western civ against my black box of Western Keynesianism?
Well, I think that there's a structural limit in the kinds of politics that has been produced by, in this country here in Britain, people who drove peasants off the land to make them landless workers, then went to Africa and kidnapped people and transported them and enslaved them to work for free. Some of its descendants went to the Americas and genocided lots of people. I think that continual history that leads up to King Leopold's killing fields in the Congo, leads up to Agent Orange and napalm destroying people in lives in Vietnam, leads up to the killing fields of Gaza, is only one aspect of a story of Western civilization that also included, for example, the creation of the modern labor movement. Absolutely. Yeah. But it is such a violent story. Yeah. And the imperialists and capitalists who have been part of that story are so peculiarly violent in their, the British culture of the stiff upper lip, which can plan torture and genocide and then have high tea, is so contemptuous. Shivanandan, the great British Marxist, said European civilization is peculiarly contemptuous of human love and human life. I think there is something peculiarly violent in that culture, which in my great tragedy, a thing I bemoan as a Jew is that the Israelis Zionism has taken that from the West and tried to own it wholesale and abandon what I think was our different culture. Of course, the major tragedy of Zionism is for Palestinians, not for Jews, but that's my personal tragedy. But I think that there is something so violent in that, that there's a limit to this openness, this fungibility. I think that, yes, you could get EU politicians to agree some kind of Marshall Plan that would ease the conditions that are producing anti-migrant politics. But the idea of Europe, the idea of Western civilization in which there's this peculiarly rational, enlightened core of the world that should be the center of the world, I think there's just a violence built into that. And we need a politics that really steps outside it.
Well, I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think there's clearly a violence built into it. I don't look at it, but I'm raised a migrant. Right? In Germany, I'm coded as a migrant. Mensch mit Migrationshintergrund. I'm a person with migrant background. And I grew up with the first cohort of non-German children that we incorporated. And literally, my year was the first year that any of us would join German schools. And the total transformation of German society, well, not total, but the dramatic transformations, especially of urban Germany, over the course of my lifetime, is one of the great wonders of my life. And to find myself now as like one of the senior figures of the migrant intellectual, it's bizarre. The migrant intellectual community was literally the first row of kids to be taken into schools. It's been very formative for me. So I'm the last person who would want to argue with you that European culture as it was understood, I'm old enough to remember when it really was literally still colonial. Forget about post-colonial. It needs ongoing transformation. But I would just see that not as the insurmountable limit of my Keynesianism. I would just say that's I would add that to the list of drugs, sex, and multiculturalism, or drugs, sex, and take your pick, like interculturalism, or that would be on that list of, and I would completely agree with you that it's, I'm going to go and spend the summer in Berlin because I feel comfortable there as a migrant. I know you laugh at me when I say this.
Of course I laugh at you because you're a
white guy.
But
I am you don't have the experience of living as a non-native speaker. When I open my mouth, other migrant people know. And that's weird. And Germany's migrant communities, Ukrainian, Russian, Polish. No.
You're all about owning your standpoint.
I'm not, but
your standpoint here is a very privileged one.
No, of course it is. Hugely. But what I'm saying is that experience, I'm not for a second, come on, deny that. It's evidently the case. But the point is that don't for a single second dig in my heels and refuse your argument that there are boundaries to European national identities in particular, and European identity in general, on the axis of black, white, and Islam and the rest, that need fundamentally overcoming and renegotiating. And in part, what I'm saying is that I think I understand that in my bones, not because I belong on the other side, for heaven's sake, but that I have this odd experience of being on the other side of the barricades, the Keynesian scenario we keep coming back to, and actually being on the other side, irreducibly actually on the other side. Cause never actually really belonging to the white, sure, but this is where your category of Western civilization is too broad and too lumpy. On the other side of a national divide, which is really profound, and so I'm really just finding an elaborate and personal way of saying I agree with you, and that involves violence is evident, and that violence needs constant attention, constant calling out, constant problematization. That Europe should never simply be allowed to stand for anything good by itself, qua Europe. You won't find any opposition from me on that score. It needs to demonstrate that it means something and can mean something else. And I'm not giving up on that project of it demonstrating. That's all I'm really saying. And I don't see any other, to go back to your original question, like where between China and the US, once we get into the geopolitical sphere, what's your bet? Like standalone UK doing some Lexit thing? Come on, like.
No, not standalone UK, but the idea that the problem with multiculturalism is that not all cultures are equal.
No.
And actually, there is one culture.
Well, I don't go there. I don't hang any. That's just a tag. If Keynes was writing that manifesto in the 1980s, he would probably have put multiculturalism there.
No, but he thinks the culture that has to be vanquished, the one culture that is so thoroughly destructive, is the culture in this country, the British ruling class, is the culture of the people who've run Western civilization.
He obviously can't.
He obviously can't engage that, and that's the culture that's produced the genocide.
But I mean, but that's a fair point. But you're bringing us back to dear old Keynes. But that's a fair point. But you would have to also to grant to him that he had a really complicated and fraught relationship to that culture.
Sure. And I guess because I'm really asking about you and about us and about the future. When Iran thinks now about the challenge in engaging with America of restoring deterrence by showing that they are able to strike against America so that the United States gets the message and doesn't freely attack Iran, I think that the Iranians are faced with a challenge, a problem, that maybe they can't treat the Americans like a rational civilization because there's a peculiar pathology. There's a peculiar kind of condition of supremacist domination, which is intrinsic to a culture forged by stealing other people's land, kidnapping and enslaving other people. So I think there's some kind of long continuity where there's a cultural core of this thing called Western civilization, which sure is flattening, to make that the whole story of the world that we live in, right? There's lots of other kinds of things going on in the world that we inhabit. But I think that a central challenge of politics in this period of the decline of Western civilization is to think how that class project of the people who have run the West for hundreds of years, and there is some continuity. Keynes talks about it a line going back to John Locke. People who've run the West and who have a set of kind of profoundly ingrained worldviews, a worldview in which some people matter and other people don't.
But I mean, I think you were right to sense that maybe here really is the nub of it, because I understand. I mean, I see exactly what you're saying, but I just think that reading of culture's effects is far too deterministic, is far too deterministic. Like, is Pete Hegseth with his crusading tattoos a legitimate, quote unquote, predictable product of a certain strand in Western Christianity? Absolutely. I mean, he wears it on his sleeve. Right? He literally says it. Is it necessary? Obviously not. Because we haven't had somebody quite that insane in the Defense Department before, and large numbers of people in the Pentagon thought he was manifestly unsuited to the job. And it is the result of a chain of situations which have led us to that point. Now, is it a mere accident? So to go back to your side of the argument, that Pete Hegseth has ended up in that position at this moment? No, I would concede that it's not, because this situation is overdetermined. And we're not just talking about like a kind of bonkers lottery in which, Donald Trump and his merry bunch of crusaders end up in power. That's not a mere lottery result. You can trace lines of determination. But are they necessary? Is this the normal mode in which American power functions? Did every other administration up to this point look at the prospect of attacking Iran and doing this thing with Israel and go, well, that looks cool. God, I'd really like to fight that war. Oh, no, another year. We're not doing that, because you know what? Down the line, there's this move the Iranians could make, which is to close the Straits of Hormuz. And that really wouldn't be good. Remember the Carter Doctrine? And so that is, I'm not going to say that's the norm. I'm just going to say that up to this point, everyone else coming out of white Western civilization that was in power in the Pentagon has no doubt had wet dreams about fighting this Crusader war and gone, that was a wet dream. But that is not what I'm actually going to do. And what we think we need to urgently explain about the current moment, in this lecture I gave at the New School a year or two back, I talked about hyper-agency. Like, why is it that a bunch of dudes with wet dreams, be it Netanyahu's project of like total revision of all the boundaries, or Elon Musk going to Mars, or Donald Trump just living the thing the whole time, and Hegseth, why are they currently exercising the power they are? That is an urgent question. But I don't think, and at no point would you deny that any of those are sort of alien to the Western civilization. Right. That's completely unhelpful. But it's a question of self-regulation. And up to this point, everyone in their right mind has been able to say, able to tell the difference between a white crusader Christian wet dream and something they're actually going to do.
Right, so there's a highly contingent question about how you get the Trump administration invading Iran when Netanyahu has been asking American administrations to invade Iran for quite some time, and they haven't done it. So you have to understand a lot more than one continuous story of Western civilization.
What you can't do is reduce all of that to Western civilization and its logic.
Totally, I agree with you. But the Biden administration, grown-ups in the room, were writing the checks for Israel's genocide in Gaza.
Yeah. And they ran it through. And I think Trumpists know they got there by stages, right? I
think it was Kwame Nkrumah who said America is such a land of luxury. It's a one-party state. You've just got two of them. Like there is a certain degree of
I wish that was still true. It truly isn't true anymore. That's an overly benign description of American state and reassuring. That is not the world that we're in. America is much, much closer to the 5 or 6 party system that you've currently got in the UK, contained within 2 parties by virtue of the first past the post system inherited from the UK and maintained because it suits incumbents. But it's really a 6-party European style system contained with that, with a faction in the middle fully conforming to that kind of vision of basically just turn-taking in the management of a plutocracy, but both on the left, mercifully, and on the right in multiple different positions. I think there are different things on offer right now.
But there's a thin line of continuity around genocide that goes back to the founding of the United States.
The US is clearly founded on genocide, I mean, like most white settler colonial projects.
So my question is whether in this moment, especially when we have politics, we're told, divided into economic issues versus culture wars, whether actually there's a kind of a way of refusing that divide with a politics of freedom that says we want people to have the time to care for their loved ones, we want people to have space for their kids to play in, we want people to have decent lives, and that identifies a culture that has to be vanquished in order for that to be the case, which is this violent culture that's been there for hundreds of years in not everyone in the West, but in the people who drove peasants off the land and kidnapped people for slavery, and that there is some thin line of inheritance that connects that to what's happening now in Gaza. Doesn't mean that you can understand what's happening now in Gaza only by that story. You also have to understand a lot of contingent things that mean that Netanyahu's prime minister in Israel rather than someone else, that mean that Trump is president in the US rather than someone else, but that continuity is the thing that has to be broken. And that thing that has to be broken is black boxed, as I say, by a technocratic politics that thinks that we can make alliances with sections of the ruling class in the West.
Look, I mean, I'm not going to be defensive of a thin line of genocidal continuity. If you want to go snap that and wage war against it, be my guest. Obviously, that is that's I mean, whether it's, however, the priority in the project of building coalitions that can exercise power in a progressive way, I would be much more skeptical about that. I'm not sure that that civilizational, cultural project is necessarily where I would start.
How can it not be?
Because the question is what we're aiming for, and again, this goes back to the very beginning of the conversation. Because the only reason I can see why you would make it the priority is you're aiming for some sort of total emancipation from the violence of the past. And so if there is this genocidal thread that runs through, clearly there cannot be any total emancipation from the violence of the past without severing that. Whereas if you assume that the aim of the game in a violent world, which has been hitherto in our history violent, is to move to a better place with less violence, then there may be other ways of containing and minimizing the threat, which is real, from that genocidal strain. And that I take to be, just in terms of your spelling out and in your terms, if you went back, all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, that will be another way of formulating what I see as, you asked me right at the beginning, if the project is this radical freedom, Adam, what is your politics? If your project is the end of violence of this type, what is my politics? My politics is the minimization of that kind of violence, its containment, knowing it, seeing it, learning to understand it, learning to spell it out loud, absolutely all of that, but not in the first instance prioritizing the cultural struggle that aims at the severing of that link.
Well, Adam, this is a great way to start a series thinking through the scale of what's wrong in our world and what those of us who want a better world have to put right and how. I find it very useful to be in discussion with you, so I hope you'll be back and we'll have more chats.
Yeah.
Keep your eye out or your ears out, viewers and listeners, for our next episode. This has been Postscript, Hope After History. Thanks so much for listening and watching.